files, which have got lots of interesting material, internal correspondence between the different Ministry of Defence departments that were responsible for looking into the topic, and also parliamentary correspondence. So you've got all the background material about the House of Lords debate in 1978 and 1979. You've also got a very clear statement of government policy on UFOs. There's a background briefing that was prepared by the Defence Intelligence staff in 1982 for another House of Lords question, and in there they say quite clearly, and it's one of the clearest policy documents that has emerged so far from these records. They say, why were UFO reports referred to the Ministry of Defence? And they reply that the government is not interested in the scientific significance of these phenomena as such. They only examine UFO reports to determine whether they could be aircraft illegally in UK airspace, i.e. Russians or some other enemy aircraft. That's the clearest statement that they've made, as far as I'm aware, on this topic. And there's a lot of confusion as to why the Ministry of Defence continue to look into this subject, and it is purely from that defence perspective.
If I was to report a sighting of a UFO, what would happen? Is there a standard form that they would fill out that we can see in these documents? Is there certain criteria?
Yes, exactly. There is a standard form that's been in use since at least the mid-1950s, and when you look through the UFO report forms that are in these records, what would happen is, if you saw something unusual in the sky, and you were quite concerned about what it could be, you would probably ring your local police station or maybe your local airbase, and they would have a standard form that they would have for the reporting of this. They would take details down from you, and you will see in these records this form. There are something like 8 or 9 sections to it, A, B, C, D, E, and it will be date of sighting, time of sighting, direction of sighting, description of what was seen. They would fill this in and they would send that through to the Ministry of Defence, and it would go to an Air Staff Secretariat branch at Whitehall that was the central focus for the collection of UFO material. They would copy it to 2 or 3 other internal branches in the MOD who would, if they thought it was a significant sighting, they may check to see if anything was seen on radar, and it would go to a variety of officials who would be interested in the air defence aspects of these sightings. Mostly they were just looking at what was seen on these forms, sometimes checking whether anything could be corroborated on radar, but mostly they didn't follow them up to any great extent. That doesn't mean to say that there isn't anything interesting in these papers, though.
Well, most of the people reported UFOs mad.
It has to be said that the vast majority of them are just ordinary people who'd seen something unusual and thought that they ought to tell someone about it. I mean, there are some very, very bizarre reports in these files. In fact, there's at least 2 in this collection that have just been released where people who believe that they've been in contact with aliens or met aliens felt the need to report what they'd seen to the Ministry of Defence.
Could you tell me a bit more about that one?
Yeah, there's the one quite interesting report that was sent in by a ufologist who'd interviewed an elderly man in Aldershot who claimed he'd been out fishing one night in 1983. He'd seen a flying saucer land by the side of the Aldershot Canal, and he'd been given a tour of this spaceship by 2 creatures dressed in green overalls who'd emerged, and they showed him around this flying saucer, and they started to scan his body, and then they said, "Oh no, you can go because you're too old and infirm for our purposes." This person reported this. He got into the local newspaper, and a ufologist went along, interviewed this witness, and sent the report to the Ministry of Defence. And he did that because he thought, well, this happened at Aldershot. It's near the military barracks. This might be something of interest. And there are lots and lots of letters like that in these files, and they're fascinating, really. But there's no evidence that any of these contact reports or sightings of aliens or anything like that were followed up by the Ministry of Defence. In fact, there's a little note on the Aldershot one that just says, no reply.
Where were most of these reports or sightings?
The majority of the sightings do seem to reflect population density, in that you do get a lot of sightings in city centres, such as certainly London seems to generate a lot of reports, and a lot of those seem to be simply of aircraft lights. But you also get, quite in these papers, there are a lot of interesting reports made by pilots, both civilian pilots and also by military pilots. For instance, there is quite an interesting report in the files from September 1985, where you got the crew of a Royal Navy Sea King helicopter from Culdrose in Cornwall, and they filed an official report on 2 unidentified objects that they tracked on radar for 40 miles. And this was sent through to the Ministry of Defence in London, and they say that the radar performance characteristics indicate that these objects were not spurious contacts, i.e. they weren't something caused by weather conditions, and they obviously thought it was something so unusual that they wanted to file an official report. So that was a military pilot in this case, but there are also lots of instances in these papers of civilian aircrew who've seen things whilst they've been on flights across the UK airspace. One in particular where the crew of a civil airliner over the UK on the 5th of September 1986 saw an unidentified object passing very close to the port side of the aircraft. And they were obviously very concerned about this. They wanted to know, they sent the report through to the ministry, they wanted to know, was this an asteroid, was it space debris burning up in the atmosphere, or was it some kind of missile? And they say in the report that if it's established that it was a missile, then the captain and the crew are very unimpressed, as the aircraft was coming into land at 19,000 feet at the time. This is just one of a whole collection of similar reports by civil aircraft crews that you can find in these papers, where they've seen things that are described as large, elongated black objects, sometimes described as missiles, that they think that they've seen flashing down through the sky, that they've thought were so close in some instances that they've reported it as an official air miss, and they've had to have an inquiry.
Can you give us some other documents or files or incidents that are contained in these files?
One of the most interesting reports in this particular collection of papers is a report of a UFO actually touching down on a civilian airfield runway in 1984 in April, and this is a report that was made by a senior air traffic controller with 14 years experience, and he and two other senior staff, both with considerable experience, were on duty in the control tower of this particular airfield, which is not identified in the papers, and they were actually talking in a light plane on one of the runways, and the senior controller scanned the sky as he reports in the papers, and he said he observed lights in the sky coming down on another runway, and told the controller his plane was actually on runway 27 and not 22, where he thought this plane was coming down. Then the plane itself called down for runway 22, and everyone at that point became aware that the object was unidentified, as they describe it. And as they were watching this thing, they said that it came down at speed in a near vertical climb, appeared to touch down on the runway, and then disappeared. And they were so concerned about this, they filed an official report. But what was the thing that they saw? I mean, there's no evidence from the papers that any further investigations were done, and it remains a mystery. I think this is one of the highlights in these files.
It's obviously a subject matter that captures the imagination. There's an example of one member of the public who believes he was actually in contact with an alien called Elgar. Yes, I mean, in the files there are lots of long rambling letters from people who've written to the MOD who believe that they've seen aliens or been in touch with aliens. And in this particular release of papers, there's a very long letter from someone in Cheshire who'd written to the MOD in January 1985 describing what he says was his physical and psychic contacts with aliens, and these are green aliens, that he'd been seeing since he was a child. And one of them, who he calls Algar, was apparently killed in 1981 by another race of beings who wanted to stop him telling the government about what he knew. And it's a very bizarre letter in which he says that he believes that he's actually been on these flying saucers, and he's been to their bases under the Wirral. And there's actually a description of how he saw one of them shot down over Wallasey Town Hall. You can imagine what the person at the MOD must have thought when he received this letter, and thought, what do I say to this person? And he simply scribbled on the letter, no reply. Would it be fair to say that if a policeman or an airline pilot or an RAF member reported a sighting, they were held in slightly more credibility or with weight than a member of the public?
Yeah, that's definitely the case. I mean, the Ministry of Defence would certainly take reports from military pilots and from civil pilots a lot more seriously than they would from reports made by members of the public. And if it was a report made by a member of the armed services and it was made in good time, that they received it and were able to investigate it very, very quickly, in some cases they would be able to sort of do a radar replay in order to see whether there was anything that was seen by the air defence system at the time that the sighting was made.